Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. I am your host, Tommy Brzee. As always, it is May 13th, and we're going to start things off talking about Urban Meyer and his take on NIL. He was on the Lou Holtz show, and he had some pretty intense words to give about NIL and the way it works in college football today. Then we're going to talk about UCLA and Cal. It sounds like UCLA might be forced to pay Cal a little bit of money over the next decade. Then we have a little bit of talk about NIL, definitely a little bit more interesting talk about just how NIL works compared to how some people might think it works in college football. Then we'll get back to spring overreactions. We'll move on to the Big 12 today before finishing out with a Good Vibes Monday, and we'll talk about that deluxe cover that was released for the College Football 25 game. So 5 segments today. The first time we're doing that, you'll hear a little bit less of me just kind of going on and on. Definitely a little bit better listening experience, I'm sure, but before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of your screen, GSMCPodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to have a fun back and forth here, maybe bring up something that I didn't bring up or ask a question that you're wondering about. So again, that's GSMCPodcast.net if you have any questions. But let's jump right in. Let's talk about Urban Meyer. He was on the Lou Holtz show late last week, and he was talking about college football and NIL in college football today. And he was talking about how it's kind of turned into an arms race, and he actually used the word cheating. He said, "This is cheating," and I'll actually give you the quote here of what he said. And he said, if Lou Holtz or Urban Meyer or Marvin Harrison Jr. or CJ Stroud, they want to go out and use their name to help sell cars, help a business, that's great. But to have 17-year-old demand money for a visit, to pay players a lot of money to go visit a charity for 20 minutes and then write a check for $50,000, that's cheating. That's not what this is all about. I'm very disappointed in where it went. And I think this is a sentiment that a lot of people share, right? I think we all look at NIL today, and there is a big time question mark of what are the rules, and given how lenient they are, is this, legalized cheating? And I think there's some validity to that. When you look at the actual argument, is this cheating by the letter of the law? Technically, no, right? We've found ourselves kind of in this area with NIL where there's not a lot that is against the rules because there's not a lot of enforceable rules out there right now. And that's, going back on tons of years of the NCAA not being where they needed to be on this and being just behind the times. So when you talk about when everything was introduced to college football, it was in 2021, and we've already seen all of the changes that have happened. I mean, Urban Meyer was coaching in 2018. He wasn't coaching in 2008, so it's not like he's been out of the game for over a decade, and, the game has totally flipped on its head over, multiple decades. It's flipped on its head in about 5 years, and it's all started in 2021 when NIL was passed. And if you remember how it was passed and how that kind of came to fruition, it was a lot of states getting together and saying, we're just going to take control of the situation. We're just going to pass our NIL laws. We're going to say it's okay to benefit off your name, image, and likeness in our state, and then we'll let the NCAA catch up. And the reality was the NCAA kind of forced their hand in that, where it took them just way too long to get an idea of we need to be paying players at least something. There needs to be a way for these players to make money, and that should have been a conversation, a decade ago. In 2005, when all the stuff with Reggie Bush and USC happened, all of this stuff should have been happening a long time ago, and I'm sure there were conversations, but they dragged their feet for quite some time. I think we can all agree on that, and it became a huge problem. So now we're in a position where you essentially have to smooth over a huge problem instead of one that could have been slowly smoothed over as you kind of go through the rules. And obviously, there was never going to be a world where you introduce something like NIL and you introduce, the world that we live in today, and it was going to be totally smooth, right? There was no world where we were going to have no problems, we were going to have no unforeseen issues or consequences or anything like that. There was a reality where there was a reality where you have rules, you have regulations in place before you fully implement this stuff, and those rules actually make sense. They're not, they can't be tried in a court of law. You can't be sued for them. You can't get yourself into as much trouble as the NCAA has found themselves in with a number of these cases across the NIL landscape the last little bit. So I think when you talk about NIL and, it looks like it's cheating from the outside, it's kind of not, partly because the NCAA has made it to where it's not. There's been this massive push over the last little bit to get common sense rules in place, and obviously that is easier said than done, and there's a ton of legwork involved in that. But the reality is the NCAA, has not necessarily been at the forefront of this in the first place. They have never been, on the cutting edge of player payment or putting players really in the best spot to fully succeed at that level. So I think when we talk about NIL and where it is today, you don't really look any further than the people that, made it really tough to start, which is the NCAA. You want them to have been out in front of this, but we're here now, right? We're where we are, and the question is now, where do we go from here, and how do we kind of curb some of the consequences that have started to happen? Obviously, revenue sharing has been thrown out there, employment has been kicked around, but that one's kind of losing steam more and more as we continue to move on. But I do think there's a world where most of these problems are not necessarily a part of the conversation anymore. And I think it has a ton to do with the people that are in the room for these conversations. I think a lot of us, including myself, are not necessarily enthused by a lot of the people that are making big time decisions in the sport. So I think that's what it all comes down to. And it's something we've talked about here on a lot, where you now have Nick Saban as a retired coach and someone that understands the game probably better than most people in college football right now. You also have former players that understand not only what it is prior to the NIL era, but it's been around for a while. You now have players that are either in the NFL or just, have moved on to other stuff that know what NIL looks like on the inside and understand the going on at each of these kind of programs. So you have people to choose from, I guess is the best way to put this, where in the past, when you weren't giving players a seat at the table, even though you probably should have, when certain coaches didn't get in the room, it created problems, and it created where we are today. But there's an easy, or not an easy way, but there's a way to kind of right your tracks here, which is essentially just introduce people into the room that haven't been in the room before. Whether that's, Nick Saban coming into the room and speaking for coaches and speaking for players and being kind of that big time voice, or it looks like a players association where you bring in players to the conversations and allow them to say with their piece, allow them to be honest about what's going on in NIL and what the issues are and how, we can at least start to kind of fix those things. So I think that's the biggest thing in my eyes, where when you look at NIL today and you look at what the future is going to look like with NIL, it's just all about the decision makers. It's all about the people in the room fully understanding not only what NIL is, but the detriments of it and the things that it can do. And you can't really fully understand that if you haven't been in the room for these conversations, which the players and the coaches have. Nick Saban has, all these other coaches that have left the game recently have been in those conversations. So you need those people in the room, period, end of story. And if you don't have those people in the room, you're never going to get a full grasp on this issue. You're never going to be able to pass rules that not only make sense, but are enforceable by law. And you're never going to have enough structure to this thing for it to make sense. And it's a battle that they're going to be fighting for quite some time. I think the NCAA, when you talk about Urban's comment overall, he's right. When you look at this, if you took what is happening today and you put it back in even 2015, people would lose their minds. There would be so many people that would be filing lawsuits and talking about other coaches, and it would be insane in college football. And it's all happened over the matter of 3 years at this point, where NIL was passed in June of 2021. It's now May of 2024, and everything has gone crazy. And so Urban Meyer's technically right. This is, legalized cheating. So I guess it's not cheating necessarily, but it is sanctioned. And it shouldn't be, but that's kind of the reality of the world we live in. And the way that you can fix this is just get a CBA in place, get a players association in place, include some of the former coaches that have been through this type of thing in these conversations, and more than anything else, actually listen to them. There's been this, huge push to have more power in players' hands, but I don't think that's necessarily led to players being able to actually have a say in how that power is actually put into action. But now, if you give them a seat at the table where they can come in and say, NIL is a dangerous thing for X, Y, and Z, and I know that because I have anecdotes about all of these different examples, then you can start to work off something that's concrete. Right now, it feels like they're working off, what an NIL could be, what NIL might be, instead of what it actually is in practice. And I think that's kind of the biggest hurdle they're going to have to get over. I do think that this has to be the first thing that checks off the list. I know we look at college football and college sports in general, and we see, a million issues, and we see a million things that they have to deal with. But NIL is at the very top of the list. And I think you'll find that if you check NIL off the list in terms of things that you have to deal with, a lot of that other stuff will get checked off without you really having to deal with it. The transfer portal, maybe even coaches moving around as much as they do. Just the unrest in college sports. I think a lot of that will be handled if you can get a good crystalline structure in place for NIL. But all of that is kind of down the road. I do have faith. I really do. I think it will be handled. I think guys like Nick Saban will get in that room. I think players will get in that room. But the sooner the better, I guess, is the best way to put it, because the longer that we let this sit, the longer that we let this kind of world that we've created in NIL fester, it's going to get messier and messier. So I do have faith. I think it's going to get fixed, but make sure that the players and former coaches and everyone that, really knows the sport is in on these conversations as soon as possible, because that could save you a lot of headache and save a lot of kids a lot of headache as well. So we'll continue to get in that throughout the time, but we're going to take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about UCLA and Cal. It sounds like the Board of Regents over there at the University of California's university system is very much pushing UCLA to pay Cal a pretty sum over the next decade. So I want to break that down after this, so stick with us.